Okay, so now we're at the second part of the visual elements, and in this lecture, we're going to cover color, texture, pattern, time, and motion. So you may want to listen to the first part first just to make sure, because I may refer to it in this PowerPoint for some of the things. So, color, in my opinion, it's one of the most expressive visual elements, but I'm also a painter, so I may be a little biased to that. But color is just so powerful, and every color that we see has so many different things about it that's very unique. Some cool things about color that aren't really related to art, but that you might find interesting. Color is not everyone sees color the same way, and some people are colorblind. And scientists started working with this paint company a few years ago, and now they have color blindness glasses that people can buy where they see the full spectrum. So it's kind of exciting that that's available for people now. And then the other thing I was going to tell you about color is that we can see as many as 10 million different colors. Obviously, we don't see that many on the color wheel. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But those are the different varieties of, there's 10 million different varieties of those colors that we see on the color wheel. Color can also affect us mentally and physically as well. And we'll talk about some of that in just a moment. Now, you don't necessarily need to know all this for an art class, but this is from a medical website and it states some of the physical reactions that people have to color. And this is the general public, so obviously everybody's not the same. Just like medicine that people take, some people can have certain reactions to it that others don't. So when they um, tested this on people, these were some of the reactions that people had. Now, there may be some bonus questions about some of this on your next test if you want to look at these a little bit. Hint, hint. So that should help you out. But some of these things, blue is a color that's really calm, and it makes people's blood pressure lower when they're surrounded by blue. A lot of people consider it a very spiritual color as well, and if you think about it, it has a loneliness kind of quality to it also. And blue also decreases our appetite and it makes us not hungry. And you may have ate at like small diners before that are like not chains that they're independently owned. Sometimes they'll have something called a blue plate special, which is a smaller portion of food on a blue plate. And that dates back to the Great Depression, back when people couldn't afford to go out to eat and restaurants were going out of business. So they started serving smaller portions on blue plates because they knew the color blue made people not as hungry. And you can Google that, so you know I'm not making it up. Some scientists say that if you put blue light bulbs in your refrigerator or you put blue paint on your walls in your kitchen, that subconsciously you may not eat as much and you may lose weight. So be careful though, because knowledge is power. So if you know this, then you can get around it. Now, green is a color that's very comforting to people, and it's supposedly good. It helps you with depression and anxiety and things like that. So, a lot of psychiatric hospitals will have their walls a different tint or shade of green. Purple and pink are also used in diet therapy. They're not considered really appetizing colors as either. Purple also helps people that have sensitivity to light because it's a darker color. It's better for people that suffer from migraines and things like that. Pink is also physically, weakens you physically. And there are jails and prisons that they paint the walls pink to make the criminals less active while they're in there. Now, the colors yellow, orange, and red, all of those increase your appetite and they make you hungry. And if you think about all the colors of the fast food restaurants, almost all of them are these colors or similar colors. And that's not a coincidence. They all know this. Like it's been known for a very long time. But the color of the paper they wrap your food in, the trays, the signs, the advertising, almost all fast food companies use red, yellow, or orange. And that's because it makes you hungry and it makes you buy more and eat more. And so those may be colors you want to avoid painting your kitchen or getting plates that are that color, unless you need to gain weight. Then that would be a good way to do that. But anyway, that's something to consider. And even if you look at your food, a lot of times your food has added dyes so that it looks more appetizing. And a lot of the dyes that they add to our food are yellow and red dye. Now, if you found that interesting, this is a website. It's basically a free color theory class that you can explore all the different fun facts about every color, um, the colors and how they affect our physical health, how they affect our mind, how we see color. It's a really cool website, and they have all their research on there too, so it's really fun to explore. It is a time vacuum because it's hard to stop reading and looking at a lot of the stuff they have on there. But if you like this, there is a class you can take at most universities called Color Theory. And it's a semester long class where all you do is study like where the pigments came from, how colors make people feel. It's a really fun class, and most fashion designers and interior designers have to take that class so that they understand the environments that they create for people. Now, color can also be very symbolic. In different cultures and religions and different time periods, colors have represented certain things. Even if we think of, current times, when people go to a funeral in the Western world, most people wear black. But in China, they wear white. And so it can depend on each culture. We discussed this kind of a little bit with the painting of Arnold Feeney and his bride in the first unit. And we talked about the green dress being symbolic of fertility. And so wedding dresses are, one thing that's symbolic using color. Now, these little circles that you see here, this is an example of what a colorblind test would look like. So if you go to the color blindness glasses that I referred to, they're called Enchroma, Enchorma. And if you go to their website, you can actually take a colorblind test to see if you may need glasses like that. But you should see numbers in these circles here. And notice the color variations are reds and greens because those are usually the colors that people struggle to distinguish between the two of those. Now, you don't need to know all of this. I just thought some people like to know all the whys and the science behind things. And according to physics, color only exists in light. So technically, when it's completely dark, we don't see colors. And so what that means is that everything has a chemistry to its surface, and it either reflects or absorbs the different colors that are in pure white light. And that's why we see the different colors that we see. Now, the visible spectrum was discovered by the physicist Isaac Newton, and he discovered it by how a pure laser of white light passed through a prism, and it created a rainbow, or what we call now the visible spectrum. He noticed that each color traveled at a different speed. Red travels the fastest and purple travels the slowest. And you don't need to know that, but it does make you understand like a lot of things we're supposed to pay attention to that are dangerous. We often label with something that's red because we see it actually faster. And he also thought that every color had a sound, and that he put music notes when he created the first color wheel. He put music notes next to each color. And he thought that there was a sound you could hear that stimulated your brain the same way that color would. And so it's kind of a fun way to think about color. Now, this is the spectrum, and what I wanted you to notice is that the colors are in the same order as we'll see them on the color wheel in just a moment. Now, one thing that you don't see in the spectrum is black and white and gray and brown. And that's because all of those are what we call achromatic colors. And the prefix a means without, and chroma means color. And so black and white and grays and browns, those are all achromatic because they don't have a presence of a color or a hue inside of them. Black is when all of the colors are being absorbed into the surface. That's what we see. And white is the pure white light that's being reflected back at us. So those don't count as colors, and neither do the neutrals, which are the grays and the browns. And those can all be used in any color scheme because they're not considered to be true colors. Now, you probably have heard the word hue before. I know I've already said it a few times. Hues are the colors that are on the color wheel. So there's only a few of those where the colors refer to the different mixtures of those. And so pink, for instance, is a tint of red, but it's a different color, and the hue is red. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you. And then colors can also represent different values. And you can think about that with, like, if you took a black and white photo of the color wheel, purple would be the darkest color in your image. And so we can use color to represent different values as well. Now, this vocabulary you do need to know, and it will be on the test. And this goes for all different disciplines. So I know I have a few sisters that are into makeup and stuff, and they watch a lot of the gurus on YouTube, like James Charles and all those people. And I've seen clips of those videos before, and a lot of times they use this terminology incorrect. And so you need to know this. It's the same whether you work at Sephora or whether you're a painter. These words and these terms, they mean the same thing. And so when people use those incorrectly, it's confusing because they think they know what they're talking about, but they really don't. So whenever we add black to a color, we call that a shade. Whenever we add white to a color, we call that a tint. So pink is a tint of red, and maroon is a shade of red. So just the other day, I saw a YouTuber that was talking about lipsticks, and it was all pinks, and they're like, these are all different shades of pinks, and I'm like, no, they're not. They're tints. So make sure you know these terms. People they don't know what they're talking about. So your job is to help educate the rest of the world once you know this. But this will help you in any class that you take where you discuss color. These words are the same. Okay. Now, one place that you will find that it's different is when you go to get your windows tinted for your cars. They make them darker, and the only thing I can think of is that they didn't have to go to art school. So technically, they're making the windows shaded. Now, chroma and intensity, that has to do with the saturation of the color, and that means in its most purest form. Whenever we mix paint together, that's making a subtractive color mixture, because the more colors we mix together, the more light that's going to be absorbed and the less is going to be reflected. If you take a theater class and you learn about stage lighting, then you will learn about additive color, and that's where you can layer the colored lights to create pure white light. Now, this is the basic color wheel. Notice there's 3 types of colors: the primary colors, the secondary colors, and then the tertiary or intermediate colors. These are just like they were in the spectrum that we saw. The primary colors are yellow, red, and blue because they cannot be made. They just occur naturally, but when they're mixed together, they make all the other colors on the color wheel. The secondary colors are orange, green, and purple, and those are made by mixing 2 primaries together. And then the tertiary and intermediate colors, those are the colors that are between a primary and a secondary color. So those would be blue-violet, red-orange, yellow-orange, yellow-green, and blue-green. And those don't have their own unique name. Their name is made by the primary color, a hyphen, and then the secondary color. Now, there will be a section on the test over color schemes, and you will have to guess the color scheme that's being shown to you. And you'll see those on the study guide, so make sure that you know those. But one of them is a primary color scheme, and that means that it would use the primary colors, yellow, red, and blue. The secondary color scheme would be using just the secondary colors, purple, green, and orange. A complementary color scheme, complementary means colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. So it's a color and then the color directly across from it on the color wheel. And so like blue and orange, those are complements. Red and green are complements. Yellow and purple are complements. And when you mix those together, guess what happens? It makes the browns. And so that's why browns are considered to be a neutral or achromatic color as well, because they cancel the color out. And then the analogous color schemes, those are colors that are neighbors that are adjacent to each other on the color wheel. So you could choose any colors that are side by side, and those would be analogous colors. And then an achromatic color scheme would be basically like black, white, gray, browns, those would all those neutrals would be an achromatic color scheme. And then monochromatic, the prefix mono means singular and chroma means color. So that means choosing one hue off of the color wheel and then making different tints and shades of it, and just using those in your composition. Okay, so we're going to go over some more examples of these in just a moment. And then on the test, I'm going to try to make it pretty straightforward so that you're not confused. All right, so these are artists that all use color in a different way, and color is important in their work. Picasso, in his early art, he used color really in a way to depict his different mood and kind of the state of emotion that he was in during that. We're going to look at that. Yves Klein, he's an artist that he loved the color blue, and we'll look at some of his work. Mark Rothko, he created colorful works that were very emotional, and they're kind of like self-portraits through color. And then Seurat, he created a movement called pointillism, which is based upon pixelization. And so hopefully you all watched the video about Devora Sperber, who does the same thing with objects, but Seurat was using tiny dots of color. So this is some of Picasso's early work. Picasso was from Spain, and when he was a teenager, he moved to Paris, France, to try to make it as an artist. Paris is kind of like the New York or LA of Europe, and especially back then, that's where a lot of artists would travel to try to become famous. And obviously, it worked for Picasso, but before he was famous, he had to work hard just like anybody else. And when him and one of his best friends moved to Paris, they were, of course, foreigners from another country. It took a while to, get situated, to get people to notice their art. And shortly after arriving, his best friend committed suicide. So he was alone in another country, struggling to make it as an artist. And he used a lot of blue in his work. And so they called it the blue period because he was kind of on his own. And although his pieces, they feel kind of sad and lonely, and like there's a struggle of some kind, there's also kind of a spiritual quality to it as well. And if you study philosophy and you learn about all the world's religions, there's a character or a person in all of the religions, or a god or goddess, that struggles in some way to achieve enlightenment or resurrection or whatever it may be. So a lot of times I think the struggle is where we connect to our faith and our hope, and we find out who we really are and what we believe in. And I think that's kind of what happened to Picasso. That's where he found his voice. Think about musicians. A lot of the best music is made when people, are struggling or going through something kind of hard. And in these images here, the one on the left is actually a self-portrait of Picasso, and it kind of looks like it could be a poster for like the starving artist. But he eventually became very successful, and but his early work was very much based upon color and his emotions. Yves Klein loved the color blue. He even did a performance piece where there was a whole orchestra playing that note that Newton said was like the color blue. So all the instruments in the orchestra, they were all playing that one note while these women covered themselves in blue paint and drug each other around on these canvases. And that was the performance. It was 20 minutes of music, this one note being played while people flopped around on canvases. Kind of strange, but this is what we call performance art, and we'll talk about it later in this class. These are some more of his blue pieces. He would put sponges and blue paint as well, and he started adding those to his canvases also. Now, Mark Rothko, his story is pretty sad, but a lot of people, they judge his artwork and they don't really get it. And it does help to know the story behind it. But I have seen people that didn't know what it was about, that they understood it too. And he had been traditionally trained to do portraiture, landscapes, all these different things, just like most artists were back then. But he was first generation American. His family had immigrated to the United States to escape some of the things happening in Europe with the world wars. And during World War II, while he was living in the United States, he felt really bad hearing what was happening to other Jews. He was Jewish and his family was Jewish, and And then he was just seeing the Great Depression happening in the United States, and he just was like, what can I paint that really captures what's happening in the world? Like, I don't know that there's a face or a landscape or anything like that that I could paint that would really make things better. And so he struggled with trying to find his own style, what he wanted to do. And then one day he just thought, well, color is our emotions. And you hear people often talk about auras and seeing people's different, colors of their emotions and of their personalities. And he thought, what if I just start painting my emotions? Like, that's universal, and people might kind of get it if there's just these fields of these different emotions that I'm painting. And so he's known as a color field painter because he literally made canvases that were taller than him. A lot of them are over 8 feet tall, and then he just painted the colors that he felt, like his different moods. And so when we see these different separations or bands of color, red is a very complex color. So here in the image on the left, we see 3 bands of red. Maybe one of those is passion, maybe one is love, maybe one of those is rage. And they ebb and flow. Like, we never feel just one emotion; we feel a range of emotions that are changing constantly. And so that's what he started to do. He would paint these big, huge canvases with his colors of emotions, and he would hope that people would stand in front of them, and because they were larger than them, those emotions would be uh, projected onto them, and it would put them in the same mood that he was in, and they would understand what it was like for him in that moment. And believe it or not, I have seen people crying in front of his paintings before, and I don't know, if they knew who he was, or if it was, a unique thing or what. But I did have a student one semester. They were supposed to go. It was a painting class, and I had them go to a museum, and they were supposed to come back and paint their version of another artist's work that they were moved by. And I had one student that she wanted to be a makeup artist and do special effects, and she was very into pop culture, and she was just a really positive, happy student and bubbly, and always talking about different things going on in pop culture. But when she came back to class after the museum trip, she was dragging a huge canvas into the classroom, and I said, what are you? Who were you inspired by? And she said, Mark Rothko. And I was like, really? Why did you like his work? What do you think it's about? And she was like, well, I know you're going to think I'm stupid, but the big the rectangles of color make me think of my makeup compacts with like different colors of eyeshadow and blush and things like that. She said, and every morning I wake up and I wash my face and I look at all my makeup, and then I look in the mirror and I say, what am I feeling today? And I choose those colors based upon my emotion to put on my face. And I started laughing, and she was like, what's so funny? Am I stupid? And I was like, no, I think you're a reincarnated Mark Rothko. I was like, I think you're going to be a great makeup artist. But she really got it. Like, she didn't know anything about him, and she felt the same kind of thing that he felt with his work. So it's kind of a cool story. Sadly, he got really depressed because he realized that the more famous he got, that the less people really saw his work and understood it, but more people looked at it. And so, sadly, in this really struggle of the world with World War II and the Great Depression, he became very successful, and it was really hard for him. He would go to these restaurants and hotels that would buy his paintings, and he would see like how fancy and rich they were and overpriced food, and he would feel depressed. Like, how can I enjoy this stuff when other people are struggling so much? And so he went into kind of a really bad depression himself, and he started drinking a lot, and he felt like he became a brand, and people would just buy anything that he made, and they didn't really see him anymore, and they didn't understand what the work was about. It just became something that was a trend. And sadly, he drank himself sick one night, and he slit his wrist and bled to death in his studio in front of his last few paintings. And an art critic at the time said, "Oh, now we believe him." And it was just sad because he was a father and a brother and a husband and all these things. But it was sad that it got to that point in his life. There is a chapel dedicated to him in Houston, Texas. If you ever want to visit it, it's free for students. It's close to a museum called the Menil Collection, and it's just a short walk from it. And it's an octagon-shaped building that has his pieces in it that he dedicated to that family. And you can go in there, it's always open, and it's like an interfaith peace chapel, basically, that anybody can go in and just kind of meditate or pray or whatever it is that you do. But I think his story is nice. And I do have to say, I know it's kind of hard to get people to think of emotions and just, solid bands of color. But if you take money away from art, and you just see it the way a kid would, it does kind of make sense. But money kind of corrupts everybody's perspective about things. Now, we can also talk about colors being cool and warm. The warm colors expand and come towards us when we see them, and the cool colors contract and recede. And so this can help us create space and depth in our work as well. If we put warmer colors on the areas we want to come forward and put cooler colors in the background, it kind of pushes and pulls things and creates an optical illusion. Now, Seurat, he understood this and he created a movement called pointillism. Now, pointillism is considered to be one of the post-impressionist movements. Impressionism started in the 1800s and in the mid 1800s, and that's where artists started working outside and doing what's called plein air painting. And that means like literally going outside in the plein air and painting. And there's two things that allowed them to do this. One was tube paint started being manufactured, and so they didn't have to make their own paint anymore, so they could carry it with them and go outside and paint. The second thing was the invention of the photograph. Once the photograph was invented, they didn't have to, paint portraits anymore. They could if they wanted to, but a lot of people now could afford to get their photograph taken instead of sitting for hours or months even for someone else to paint them. And so a lot of artists started going outside, and they realized because they were going outside that color and light are always changing depending on the time of the day and things like that. And color and texture is really one thing that art had still over photography. And so they started working looser with their brushstrokes and also working more expressively with color. And so, with the post Impressionist movement, we had artists like Vincent van Gogh, Seurat, and others that started getting more abstract with their works. So, really, abstract art, I think, was born because of a reaction to the photograph. And so, Seurat was one of the post Impressionists that he, instead of really using brushstrokes at all, he just started putting dots of color on his canvas. And from a distance, they blurred together and create other colors and values, making an image. But up close, it looks like tiny little dots. And what's cool about this was a reaction to photography, but this is what inspired digital photography because it's also based upon pixels. Now, at the time in the 1800s, this was considered offensive. Critics actually said that it looked like a shotgun was fired at a canvas and that it was just a big mess of dots. But what they didn't understand is that it was very scientific and very precise. And later, it's what led us to digital technology. And it's very beautiful as well. Now, we're going to go through and we're going to look at some of the color schemes. And this is kind of what it's going to be like on the test. But of course, it's going to be multiple choice for you on the test. But you need to make sure that you're able to know these. So I'm going to show you a work of art, and then you'll have to choose what color and temperature there is with what color scheme and what temperature is used. So the easiest thing to do is to look at the work and try to identify what colors that you see on the color wheel that are present in the work of art. And it can be tricky because sometimes there are tints and shades of those colors instead of the pure form of that color. So here we see tints and shades of like red, red violet, and those are both colors that are side by side. So that would be what we call the analogous color scheme, and those are warm colors. Now here we see this group portrait, and we see blues, and we see red and yellow, and then a lot of neutral colors. And so those colors, red, blue, and yellow, those are what we call the primary color scheme. The primary colors are in a primary color scheme. In this composition, we see purples, we see greens, and we see oranges. Those are what we call the secondary colors, so this would be a secondary color scheme. Now notice in some of these you see black and white and browns and again grays. Those are what we call neutrals or achromatic colors. So those they don't count. They can be added to any color scheme. Now this one it's a little more challenging, but if you look at it, you'll see there's like tints and shades of red and tints and shades of green. And if you look on the color wheel, you'll see those colors are across from each other. So red and green are what we call complementary colors. Therefore, this is a complementary color scheme. Here we see just one hue. It's red, but we see tints and shades of it. And remember, we call that a monochromatic color scheme, and it is a warm color because red is a warm color. Now here we see the same thing, but this time we see blue used in different tints and shades, and so you would call that a monochromatic cool color scheme because blue is a cool color. In this one, we can see there's no color at all. It's just browns and grays and blacks and whites, and so we call that an achromatic color scheme. And then here we see, if we look close, we can see different tints and shades of blue, blue-green, blue-violet. Those are all those colors that are side by side. And so you would call that an analogous color scheme, and those are what we call the cool colors. Now, texture is an element that we see on everything. And when you hear the word texture, I know I always think of my sense of touch. It doesn't make me think of what I see, but more about touching. So we could say texture is refers to the tactile qualities of surfaces. And since we're not really supposed to touch most art, so don't touch art when you go to the galleries and museums, unless it's like a special exhibit that allows it. But it's more about if we were to touch it, how it would actually feel. And so actual texture is the actual surface, how it feels if you were to touch it, and simulated or implied texture would be creating a texture that's not there but making it look like it is. And I'm going to show you some examples of that. So obviously if you saw this piece on a test, hopefully you would think texture because it's a spoon and a cup and a saucer all covered with animal hair. And you may think, well, why would someone do that? Why is that art? Well, this artist thought that we kind of get too comfortable with our sense of texture of things. And so she covered these things that are smooth with fur, and it makes you think about taking a sip of your coffee or tea in the morning and getting a hairball. You would notice it much more when normally you don't really think about those sorts of things. Here, this would be an example of implied texture or simulated texture, and that's because this painting is actually smooth and it's flat. However, the artist, by using the other elements like value and color correctly, the artist was able to make it look like you could see the textures on the clothing and the dog and the floor, everything else. So implied texture, like paintings that are flat but look like things are real, that would be implied texture. And then sometimes artists kind of create their own invented texture, and that would be more of like the abstract kind of art or non-objective art. And the reason I'm showing you an up close of this Van Gogh painting, Starry Night, is if you could see his work up close, it looks like icing on a cake because he a lot of times used, instead of a brush, he would use a palette knife and he would put the paint on like it was icing. And so up close, you can see these really thick ridges and valleys. And we call that technique after Van Gogh, we call it impasto painting. And so I always think of like paste, and it's using thick paint or a palette knife or a brush and leaving it like that instead of smoothing it out. And that brings us to pattern. Really, I don't think of pattern as an element, more as a principle of design, but the book threw it in this chapter, so I just thought I would explain the difference. Pattern has nothing to do with a sense of texture or touch. Pattern just means anything that's being, any repeated element over and over and over. And so the thing that's being repeated is what we call a motif. And you've probably heard that word before. And so if you think of patterns, sometimes they're flat, but they could be a texture as well, because it depends on, if you think of like hair, like on an animal, there's a lot of hairs being repeated. So there's like lines that are being repeated. So that is a pattern, but it also is a texture. But a polka dot pattern, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has a rough texture to it. It could be just dots repeated over and over, and it could be kind of flat. In a stripe pattern, the line is being repeated. So really, a pattern is just any element being repeated over and over. Since the beginning of time, we have used patterns on objects that we create. I think personally, we like to make things reflect part of who we are, and we just like to decorate the things that we use. This image on the left hand side of this little abstract figure of a woman, people believe that may be one of the very first sculptures ever made. It dates back as the oldest sculpture that's ever been found. And all over the world during this prehistoric time period, they started carving statues of these abstract women. And they believed that maybe this was because they thought women were like gods, that they could produce life, and they didn't understand how they were able to have that ability. And so they made the parts that were essential for life larger or abstract than they really were. I doubt that people in the prehistoric time were this heavy, but they knew that people that were heavier probably lived longer during that time period, and they could probably survive childbirth. They also knew that the baby would want milk, and so by enlarging the breast, and this would have sustained the life of the child probably better. And so we believe that these people added all these patterns because they were adding what was necessary for life. And if you like that kind of thinking about why and how people made stuff, there's a link here to a YouTube video from a series called How Art Made the World. And it's about scientific studies about proving why people make art. And they talk about this figurine. It's often referred to as the Venus of Willendorf, but I like to call it the Woman of Willendorf because Venus makes you think of mythology, and that was literally thousands of years later. So this is much older than any religion that we know of. But we always put patterns on things. Even if you look at toilet paper, if you look at notebook paper, everything has patterns on it. Like we put patterns on everything. Now, time is also an element, and we could think of time as a continuation or a succession of events. And so there are artwork that we call that we can see an element of time in. And sometimes we think of you hear comic books called sequential art because they tell a story in a sequence or succession. And artists can capture stop moments in time, like if they want to sketch something or take a photograph. But then we can also do it, like I said, with kind of a storybook sort of plot, like a comic book or an illustrated story. And for a lot of the artwork before most people could read, that's how they told the stories. Now, this does have hieroglyphics on it if you knew how to read those, but you can see the same person wearing the white robe repeated 3 times in this drawing. And this was an ancient Egyptian drawing that would help people enter the afterlife. And so we can see there's 3 stages to get to the afterlife. There's one where their heart would be weighed against a feather. And if it was heavy, that meant that they had lived a bad life and they wouldn't be able to move on. And if it's lighter than the feather, then that means they get to go to the next step where they would be asked questions by one of the main Egyptian gods named Osiris. And if they answered the questions truthfully and honestly, they would get to go up to the afterlife where they would be greeted by all those people that had gone before them. So there's like 3 stop moments in this story that make up a bigger story. So they show different moments of time. Now, this example, this is someone that was a scientist that worked at MIT. However, it's such a powerful invention, it inspired technology and art. And so this invention of this camera that could capture fractions of seconds allowed us to see things that we'd never been able to see before. So you can imagine as an artist, you would be like, whoa, this is so cool, being able to see these high-speed things stopped and frozen. But as a scientist, you can imagine it would also help us understand the laws of physics and other things like that. So technically, he was a scientist, but I threw it in here because I think it inspires a lot of art as well. But he created a camera that could capture 1/100,000th of a second. How and they understand that, I don't know. But we can see this perfect crowning effect of a ball falling into a bowl of milk. And no one had been able to see this before because it happened so quickly. The same thing with bullets. We knew that they made holes, but we didn't know what else happened. We knew they made holes and messes. And with the invention of this camera, we were able to see the science behind it and all the things that are happening. And now there's a whole study in ballistics and blood splatter and all these other things that came about from this invention that allowed us to see moments that happen so quickly like this. So these are just some more images. When a jet breaks the sound barrier, it creates this cloud-like effect, but it can only be captured with a camera because it happens so quickly we can't see it. And I don't know what's happening here. I'm an art teacher, not a scientist, but it does look really cool. So it's really amazing that we've invented these cameras that can capture moments in time that we can't even see. And it allows us to understand the world and also be amazed as well. Manipulated time is a little bit different than stop time, and you guys are all aware of this. These links are to cameras that capture several frames per second, but now this is on most of our cell phones, and we see these cameras being used everywhere. There's a channel on YouTube called the Slow Mo Guys where you can see some of these cameras being used to capture high-speed things, but then slow down so we can understand them more. But we live in a world today where we can pause TV, we can rewind it, we can manipulate it. Most of our cell phones can do time-lapse imagery as well as fast imagery and things like that. So we grew up in an age where we manipulated time and recordings. Where back when film was first invented, we didn't know how to do all those things just yet. And then the last element is motion, and motion refers to actual movement. Now, this can be implied in two-dimensional art, but it can also be actual in sculpture, and we call that kinetic sculpture. So implied motion means that it has a sense of movement. And these images, you'll see it looks like blurred photographs, but they're actually paintings. And when photography was invented and they started trying to capture moving objects, a lot of the photographs were blurred. And believe it or not, painters thought that was really cool looking because no one had seen that kind of stuff before. So painters started trying to paint objects moving that look like blurred photographs. And they called that movement Dadaism or Futurism. And so you can see here's someone walking down the steps. This is a person walking their dog. And you can see the implied motion. Now, in this image, we see different people in succession and a horse running. And this artist, Edward Muybridge, he was a photographer that captured horses running at horse races, and he made a bet that all the horses' legs came off the ground. And when he put all the photos out proving it, he saw that their legs do come off the ground. But when he saw the photos in a row, he realized like that kind of makes it look like it's moving. And that's how the invention of the flip book came, with images, and you flip them and it makes what looks like a little motion picture. And that's what led Thomas Edison to creating the motion picture. So it all came about from people betting at a horse race. Now, Thomas Eakins, he was a photographer that he thought, what if I don't advance the film? What if I keep re-exposing it? And he captured this really blurry image of someone pole vaulting. And what's cool about that is no one had ever done it before, but it also captured motion. And today we use that same technology to show people how to use equipment, but also we can use that technology to capture like great events in sports and things like that as well. And then these are some examples of kinetic sculptures. And Alexander Calder made mobiles which spun around in galleries, but he also made some that were mechanical that had batteries that made them move as well. So you will see kinetic sculpture or sculptures that actually move. If you live here in Texas, if you go to North Park Mall, they have a lot of the artwork from the Nasher Sculpture Center on display there, and there are some sculptures in there that are actually they're moved by electricity of people hammering and things like that. So that would be actual motion. All right, and this concludes the visual elements. And next we'll be talking about the principles of design.